I'd like to tell you about the time I was giving one of my first conventions. I don't know if it was in the, trying to think back, it must have been around the 60s. I'm not sure of the date. But as I was teaching when we were on 11th Street in the Village, enough people became interested, and when Fred Rome came down, and he was the biggest, the most wonderful paper folder we knew at the time. He was one of the masters here. We had him come down, and he always chose Election Day because that was the weekend that gave off. And he came down to come, and that's how the convention evolved. I never had more than 30. I had them in my little place on 11th Street, and I fed them. They came in at various times Saturday morning, and everybody had to sit down for a cup of coffee and breakfast, and we got started, and then I served lunch and dinner. And of course, I only have my one table that we eat on and work on. So I remember that when it came noon, I had to say to the people, I'm sorry, will everybody please take a walk for half an hour? Because we had to clean the table and serve the food. And we had a youngster, he was about 13 or 14 at the time, I believe, and that was John Montrole. And he came, and for company, he brought his younger sister, who was about a year younger, because he said he didn't want to come alone. He had her for company. And these two children were so remarkable. I knew nothing about them. I later learned a great deal of surprising things, but at the time, they were just the two young children, and they in no way disturbed the grown-ups. And we folded hour after hour after hour. That it was a grilling thing. You had to really be a lover of origami to be willing to sit at the table hour after hour and concentrate. But these children, we never heard a word from them. They were impeccable. They were so pleasant, and yet they never spoke. And they ate. They stood in line when we served buffet. They didn't ever say anything. And finally, when Saturday night came, I was concerned because everybody was supposed to take care of their own sleeping arrangements, because that I couldn't possibly manage. So I said to the children, where are you going tonight? Are you being taken care of? And they said, oh yes, my father has a friend who lives down at, who teaches at NYU, and he has a place there. We're going to stay the night there. So I was perfectly satisfied. They were called for and brought back on Sunday. But other than that, I never knew they were there, except that they were no trouble. They never asked, how do you do this? All the directions were appropriate. I mean, they could do it. They were no bother at all. They were just wonderful. And they came after that every year when I had my conventions. I call them conventions. Well, you know that I had another marriage. My first husband's name was Kruskal. But people who didn't know me, who knew me recently, only know me as Mrs. Oppenheimer. So this is what happened. John Montrole comes from a family of 10 children. His parents are very, very distinguished scientists. The father is a physicist and a fellow of the American Academy of Science in Washington. Incidentally, my son, Martin David Kruskal, is a fellow of that too. And the Montroles lived in Princeton for a while before they moved up to Syracuse, and then wherever they moved after that. So they were very intimate with my children, Laura and David Kruskal, in Princeton. But I didn't know them. I don't know my children's friends because we live different lives. It seems that at that time, when my son was head of the department, the Applied Mathematics department, he used to have a colloquium every Friday where he would invite a famous physicist or mathematician or someone famous in the field for the benefit of the students. And they would have a tea at the college. And then if it was a personal friend, he was invited to the home of my son and daughter-in-law for dinner with other guests. And one day, one colloquium was devoted to Dr. Montrole. And when he came back for dinner, and they all sat around the table, there were other guests too invited to meet this illustrious man, my daughter-in-law, Laura, naturally turned to him and said, well, how are the children? Because they had been good friends when they lived in And Dr. Montrole said, oh, they're all fine. And, oh, yes, something unusual. My 16-year-old son is publishing a book. So everybody marveled. A book at 16, what does a child of that age have that nobody else knows, that he's so steeped in that he can write a book on the subject? So they said, well, what is he writing it on? Oh, Dr. Montrose said, something I don't believe you've ever heard of, origami. So of course my children whooped, and they said, David said, my mother, Lillian Oppenheimer, started it all in America. And then that was the first time he heard the name Oppenheimer. He didn't know that that was my name, and of course he knew where his children had gone. So isn't that a funny thing that there was, and I had no idea that had they mentioned mathematician to me, that they were going to stay at a mathematician's house overnight, I might have mentioned my son's name, and then they would have known right away. But all the time, neither one knew who I was. I thought that was a funny thing. Well, he didn't, that book took years to publish because the publisher that he had left it with turned out to be a dud. He didn't want to print it, or something happened after he held it for a couple of years. So he went to, John Montrose went to Dover, and this was the result of that, this origami for the enthusiast. And this boy is so remarkable. He has such a facility for making them extremely difficult. That's a field, because usually nobody ones. But Dover does such a beautiful book. The printing, the color, and the models are done so beautifully, and the price is so inexpensive that anybody can pick it up. Nice, big, open models. So Dover took it and really made money on it because he sold so many that soon John had a second book. And this was called Animal Origami for the Enthusiasts, so that it would be connected with the first one. And I'm afraid that John didn't make much money because this is a reprint house and never pays the authors anything as a rule. In fact, they never used to print any books by living authors. And so John has had a career, and now he's on his third book, which he says he's going to do himself. He wants to be his own publisher. He has a brother who's willing to take his pictures of all the models, and a sister who can help him with the drawings, which I think he does himself now. And we're also excited about the third book when it was announced last year that most of us gave him the money already for the book. Well, it still isn't out. His brother that was interested went to law school, and he was so involved with what he was doing that he kept putting off helping John. But we all have our thumbs crossed that we're going to get that third book in the near future. But that's the joke about John, and he's wonderful. He is a producer and so prolific. He has enough in his mind and probably on paper for 2 or 3 more books. He's a most creative young man. He's brilliant in his field. What he would like to do is to be his own publisher now, and I thought that was interesting. When I first met Robin Harvin, and then I had the permission from him to call him Ned, which was his real name, and I felt I was really one of his intimates when he allowed me to call him Ned. He was born in South Africa, but he lived most of his life in England, and he was I think he was the 7th greatest magician in the world, because I remember a show that was put on for television, and it was the 12 of the biggest magicians in the world, and he was one of them. He was the man, you know how they saw the woman in half, that trick? Well, he perfected one where the woman is sawed in thirds. And he did print a large book many, many years ago, which then sold for $50, which had all his secrets. And I wanted one very badly, but he wouldn't give it to me because I wasn't a magician. He only wanted it for magicians because it was his secrets. But I had one day asked him so much to teach me some trick, because I had tried magic when I was younger, and I was always frustrated because I couldn't do any of them. And I begged him to teach me the Cutlery Store, which is the very famous beginner magician's trick of taking a rope or a cord, cutting it and restoring it again. You've seen it many times, I'm sure. So I begged him to teach it to me, and he did. But I had just flown over, and I was full of jet lag, and I was sort of groggy. I'm using that as an excuse because I couldn't learn it. I tried and I fumbled, and I'm not good with my hands, and I couldn't say, please excuse me, I'm full of jet lag and I want to get to bed and sleep it off. But anyway, after that, he had no respect for me as a magician. So I felt very badly about it. But anyway, he came over to see me every time I visited my daughter, and I went once a year because my daughter lived in London at the time, and every year I came over for their birthday. So I always spent an hour or maybe more with Harvin on every visit. He told me about I did meet his wife too. She'd come over sometime, but she had to sit on some kind of a blown up pillow. She had been badly burned. I don't know exactly what it was. I've made my own scenario about it, but I might be wrong. I think that she helped him in his act, like all magicians have pretty girls in their act. And whether it was so far ago, so long ago, that they had lights instead of incandescent lights for footlights, I don't know. But she must have worn a dress that in some way caught fire. And she was very badly burned, and she spent months and months. As you know, it's a long recovery. And Harvin always must have felt very guilty about it, because I noticed that he was particularly attentive to his wife. He did bring her over to Rosalie's many times, but she wasn't interested in origami. In fact, she was always quarreling with him, was angry about it because he never made any money in it. It wasn't until he published a series of little books that he began to make a lot of money for the first time, because he did all his own drawings. He taught himself how to draw, and did all the drawings, and it was a small book, and it sold for very little, and it was a series, and went number 1, 2, 3, 4, and I think then he died. But those books made a lot of money, and from that time on, she was very sympathetic about his wish to spend the time to do it, because it takes an awful lot of time. But anyway, when I first met him, he told me the story that he was in the hospital with his wife, and the librarian went by with a cart of books, and in it was this book, Paper Toy Making by Margaret Campbell. And he had gazed through it, flipped through it, and he saw that there were things made out of paper. Well, every magician uses paper in some form or another in his act. And he thought that he had discovered either something that was long known and forgotten, or else hadn't been introduced to the public yet. And he was terribly excited about it. And he began to do some of the folds, and he went through the book. And this was at the time that he had made the acquaintance of Gershon Legman in the south of France. And Gershon Legman knew Yoshizawa and knew a lot about what happened in certain countries and whether they had done the work, because in Spain they were working with paper too at a very early time. So it seems that Ned always slipped either a 10-pound note or a 5-pound note, I don't know how much, to Gershon Legman, and Gershon furnished him with a lot of information. Now that all came after the book, after his book, which was Paper Magic, I think I've shown it before, was ready to go to print. So he stuck it in anyway, whatever information he got from Legman, and so that makes his book very interesting to us, because so little is known about anything that happened in the olden times with the paper. So anyway, this is the book that Margaret Campbell wrote. She was at the time in her 90s. Her husband had business dealings with the Orient and took her every year on his business trips. So she used to come back with folds and entertained her grandchildren. And her son, Roy Campbell, who was a very famous poet, I understand, of yesteryear, importuned his mother to put it in book form for the benefit of his family later on. So that's how this book came out. It has a great many of the traditional folds. In fact, all of them are traditional, but it's a little bit difficult to follow because the directions are really not the best. It's very difficult to try to describe origami if you don't know the secret. And the secret is to use one of Mr. Yoshizawa's books, because his symbols are so clear. He has arrows and signs that are undoubtedly tell you what to do when you don't need the Japanese language. So it would be a great advantage if everyone would use his signs and his symbols. But unfortunately, we've tried, but that have not been successful in that. We asked everybody in the beginning when we first started, and we were a few of us, to please use Mr. Yoshizawa's symbols whenever possible, so it would be one language that we would understand. Then nobody need to worry about the Japanese. But it seems that we cannot be successful in that. I had asked Toshiya Takahama if she would talk to several of the Japanese authors who were publishing books on origami to get together and agree, whatever it was, to use one sign language so that everybody would understand it. And there was a great argument among the four of them, each one claiming you should use my symbols, they're the best. And of course, we didn't think anyone's was better than Yoshizawa's. And they certainly wouldn't agree to do with his, because Yoshizawa has kept himself apart from all the other paper folders in Japan by saying that they did not do the real origami. He said to me through his interpreter one day, I do the real origami. If you do not do what I do, you are not doing the real origami. Now, anybody can take a piece of paper and fold it in half. It doesn't have to be his way of folding it in half. How many ways can there be? If you take your paper and fold it in half, even if it's from point to point or side to side, why aren't you doing the real origami? It's because he hasn't put his seal of approval on it. He's an extremely jealous man, because he is the only one who has devoted his entire life. I should have had one of his books, but he's written so many beautiful books. And Yoshizawa's books have the most beautiful photography I've ever in my life seen. And his symbols are so clear that no one need have any hesitation about being able to follow his models. They are so beautiful. But nobody else will give in, so we have all kinds of a mishmash with it. However, I want to tell you about Claude Sarrassas. This is a book that originally was in a very large size. And the few people that I knew in origami talked about it, the few that had the good luck to see it. I was told that if I went to Chicago and went to the public library and asked to see it, they would take a key and go somewhere and come back with it. And you would be allowed to look at it in the presence of the librarian, and then you had to give it back. That the paintings were so beautiful in here that it was classified as, unfortunately, she called it the ABCs of Origami. And when I saw it in Chicago, and I did the same thing here in our library, public library, I asked to see it, and they took a key, and I had to wait while they got it, and then I was only allowed to see it in the presence of the librarian. The pictures are so absolutely charming, and I wanted so badly to get in touch with Sarrassas. There's the crow, and you see he looks like he's actually grasping the tree trunk. And I happen to have a grandfather who was in the raw fur and hide business many, many years ago. And he had some customers in China and Japan. And when I asked if I could get this book, if it were still in print, if I could get it, I think we almost spent a leg and an arm to try to get it, but my grandfather had a customer, and the customer was nice enough to take his automobile and go up and down the streets, because the streets were marked so poorly in those days. The city had grown so quickly that they really didn't have a good way of marking their buildings. And so all he could do was go up and down and try to find out from neighbors where this woman lived. And finally he did get a book for me, and it was a very large book, and it was exactly this book. And it was a book I brought with me when I went to be interviewed on all the television stations, because it was such a beautiful book to show. And nobody, of course, had seen it. So I was anxious to get a hold of Claude Sarrassas to write to her. And I spoke to Shari Lewis about it once when we were speaking, and she said she knew that Sarasis's father was an ambassador in France from their country, and I'm trying to think what country it was. It was one of the Oriental countries. That's just escaped me for the moment. So she got the address of this ambassador in Paris for me. And I wrote to him and told him that I was so interested that I'd opened the Origami Center of America, and that I had a copy of his daughter's beautiful work, and was there any way that I could get in touch with her? Would he give me the address? So he did. And it seems that her husband and she lived in Japan for a while. I think her husband was a teacher. And she said the Japanese people were so kind to her that she wrote this book and dedicated it to the, and we'll read the dedication in a moment. I'm just trying to show you how beautiful these photographs, these pictures are. And she has them in 3 languages, English, French, and Japanese. And as you see, there are no words or no language other than a few pictures here. So unless you are well versed in origami, you're not going to be able to do the models unless you're very clever. But this is the only thing I didn't like, because it didn't have Japanese faces. The children have American faces. And I did finally write to her, and the whole thing took about 5 years before I could get into correspondence with her. And she's a charming young woman, young mother, and told me that her daughter, one of her daughters, had contracted polio while in Japan. And the people were so kind to her all through this child's illness. That was just the way she repaid their kindness, by publishing a book. And I just want to see whether there is some notation in the beginning. I think this is this is Z, yes. See if there's something in the beginning that would tell us about, no, it's just my introduction that I had written here. So I don't see anything about that. But that's what she wrote to me, that she had done it in honor of the Japanese people. And I had a friend who was going up to Peter Van Note. In fact, he edited some of the Origamians, the little newspaper that I got out. I must tell you about that too sometime. He was the editor for a short time, and he told me that he was going up to Vermont. Now, Charles Tuttle is a famous publisher who has been here for years and years. He's married to a Japanese woman, so he spends all his time in Japan, but he comes here for a few months during the summer. And Peter Van Note said to me that he was going to make an automobile trip with his family for their vacation up to Vermont, and he expected to stop in at Tuttle's. And if he should have the good fortune to meet Mr. Tuttle himself, could he try to make arrangements in my behalf to have a book reproduced, this book reproduced. That was the only publisher we knew anything about who was here. So he did go up and he did speak to him, and I was in touch with Mr. Tuttle about reproducing the book. In the meantime, I had corresponded with Mrs. Sarasis, and she had sent me some of her paintings with origami, and she was just charming, and I suggested to her that we try to have the book reproduced, and she gave me the power to go ahead and do it, anything that I could manage. Being so far away, I wasn't in contact with anybody, but Peter got me in contact with Mr. Tuttle, and I'm afraid I'm not a very good bargainer. He's a very strong businessman, and he knew where he could push his weight against somebody who was inexperienced, because I wanted to get something for her in cash. I wanted to get some monetary recognition from this wonderful book. Because when we tried to have it reproduced, she had given me permission to have it reproduced, they all objected to the name, the ABCs of Origami, because children would never take a book out. A 10-year-old would never take an ABC book. He'd think that's a kindergarten book, and that wasn't what she meant. She just did it because she did every letter in the alphabet. She did an animal or an origami piece from. That was why she called it the ABCs. So Mr. Tuttle said he would publish it, but he certainly wasn't going to give any cash for it because it was just a reproduction. But he offered 25 books for the author. And I said, well, what's she going to do with 25 books? That's not enough compensation. But I couldn't budge him, and I wasn't with him. We all tried to do this all by letter. So I finally asked her if she'd be willing if it was reproduced without getting her any money, and she agreed. So when he reproduced it, he reduced it to the size. And I do believe it has sold pretty well because he's kept on publishing it right along. And if it hadn't sold, I guess he would have discontinued it. But it was such a beautiful book, and it was the one I took with me in every television station that I was at. Well, should I have this on my lap, or is it distracting, or? No. Anyway.
Go ahead.
I'd like to go back to 1954, when Harry Oppenheimer and I were married. We had an apartment in Gramercy Park, and we had a big deck about 30 or 40 feet, which was just wonderful. We had plants and a hammock, and we ate outdoors. It was lovely. And it was at that place that I went around the corner to the bookseller and begged her to sell the only book that I had on origami, and she refused because I didn't have a big enough public for her, and that started me off in selling books and paper. And while I was there, our neighbors across the catwalk, this was an addition put on the roof of a low building after the war, when it was difficult to find building materials and to get anybody to do anything, that the hotel had put on these two apartments connected by a catwalk. And my neighbor across the walk from us, we soon got to know, and one day we invited them up to our place in Rye. Harry had a beautiful place on the water in Rye, and we used to go up every weekend. So we took our friends up there. And when Saturday morning came, we went up Friday night. When Saturday morning came, I said to them, you'll have to excuse us, but at 11 o'clock every Saturday, we tune in on Shari and Shariland. And I thought they might be disgusted with us because it was a child's program, but Harry and I wouldn't ever miss it. So they sat down, the couple sat down, and at the end of the show, they have the credits. And all of a sudden, my neighbor said, oh, there's my nephew. I didn't know he had anything to do with television. And he was the producer of the show. So there I had my entree to meet Shari. I immediately said to her, do you think your nephew could arrange a meeting? Because we admire her so much, and I would love to meet her. I'd love to take up ventriloquism. So after a long time, she wasn't too anxious to, she hadn't seen her nephew or something, but finally it happened that I had an appointment, and I could go to the station and see Shari for a few minutes before one of the rehearsals, before she went on the air. So that's why I had the joy of meeting her, and I asked her if she thought that a woman of my age, let me see, that I must have been then about 56 or 58, that was very old. And I said, do you think that a person as old as I could still learn ventriloquism? Because I have such a desire to, I'm so frustrated, I can't make out where it comes from. She said, yes, a lot of my retired friends do it, and it's quite a nice thing for people of your age, because all you have to do is train your vocal muscles to do something that they never did before, your lips, and you can have a lot of fun with it. And I will give you the only responsible teacher in ventriloquism here in New York. I know him, Monsieur Brunard, and she wrote the address, gave me his name. I subsequently thanked her, and after that our friendship grew as I taught her certain folds. I used to teach her folds, and she said that she got more fan mail on the things she did with what I taught her than with most of her magic that her father taught her. And she's been doing public shows since she was 4 years old. She did her first magic show when she was 4 years old. She's very talented and one of the sweetest women I have ever met. Not at all the type that you can meet in the theatrical world, where they're all surface. She is very sincere and honest. And I used to meet her once a week at her hairdresser's, where I taught her one model. She wouldn't let me teach her more than one at a time. She says, "You're like my father, cramming all these things down my throat. Just give me one at a time and I'll be satisfied." And while she had her nails done, and then when she had to go into the dryer where she learned the script for the next day, she was always one day behind in her scripts. And then, of course, I left. So I had time with her once a week. And the things that I taught her were so interesting for her because she said she got so much fan mail. Anyway, it developed into a beautiful friendship, and she asked me to write a book with her. She said, "I write a book every year, so if you will write one with me on origami, I would like it very much." So I agreed. I was absolutely enthralled with her. She was so beautiful and charming, and she knew all the publishers. I didn't have to do anything. She went to one of the publishers and came back, one of the biggest ones, and said, "Lillian, they say they'll print a book for us, but you can only have 5 illustrations on it for a model." Now, the publisher never knew what origami was, had never done it, had no idea. Why should he lay down the rules? I said, "Sherry, it can't be done. I can give you a base. Maybe we can get it done with 5, a very simple base. 5 drawings or 5 illustrations, but then if I want another base, from that base, I'll have to have more. Even if I use just that one, because as the more intricate it gets, the more you need pictures and illustrations." So she turned them down. But see how stupid some people are? They prescribe for you in a language that they know nothing about. So she finally found a very good publisher, and what happened actually was she was getting married at the time, and her husband, Jeremy Tarcher, had just gone into the publishing company with Stein & Day. Stein & Day was just a new company at the moment, just had been formed. In fact, the original book of Folding Paper Puppets was a hardcover, and on the back was a picture of 3 of my grandchildren and 2 of her husband's sons. And there were lots of pictures of Sherry and me in the book. But then later on they went into paperback. They were so popular. Strangely enough, is one of the few craft books that ever lasted past the first edition. It's 27 years that they've been publishing these books. There were originally 3. One year we did Folding Paper Puppets, and at the time Harry had died, and that was in '62. So she gave me the dedication page. And then when they sold 40,000 copies over the air, she just talked about them, and 40,000 copies were sold. So you can imagine they were willing to do a second one. And the second one was Folding Paper Toys. And to that we didn't stick to origami so much. We did paperwork. You could cut, here we were very traditional about it and very pure. So these are things that do a lot of, they fly, or they're magic, or they're furniture. And it wasn't particularly a real origami book. But she sold so many of these, being on the air, that we did a 3rd book, Folding Paper Masks. That was done by Mr. Baggi. I haven't mentioned Mr. Baggi because he's no longer with us, but he figured a lot in the beginning of my starting the Origami Center. He was an Italian who had no education. He was kicked out of 3rd grade because he did nothing but make the children laugh at all the things that he could make with paper, with anything. He could pick up a wire. He had the most wonderful imagination. He could cut your profile and make a cartoon of it. In fact, he said that his scissors took him around the world 3 times, because whenever he needed money, he'd just go to a nightclub and ask to go out and cut profiles, and he always gathered enough money to take him to the next stop. And he did the book on paper masks. He gave us the masks. That didn't sell so well, so they discontinued it after a while, until Sherry went to one of the big book fairs that take place every year in Germany, and met the buyer from Israel, the buyer of books from Israel. He was delighted with the mask book. He thought that would be just the right thing for Purim, that everybody there makes masks, but I don't know if it ever developed because I never heard anything about it later. But anyway, these two have lasted for 27 years, and Stein and Day is not going to give up publishing them because they're so popular. I don't know why. I don't think that, but they were very easy books for the beginner. A child, we tested it so that a child who didn't read could do it. We used those wonderful symbols of Mr. Yoshizawa. And if you don't mind my taking the time to show you, if you'll notice, I'll show you the first thing that we did here. This is the toys. This is the first book, the puppets. And we wanted it so that a child who didn't read would understand what the drawings said. Can you see this? There's a square of paper, and the arrow shows where you should fold the paper so the 2 points meet. And you always look to the next model to see what you should look like. There's the first direction, and then you look on number 2 and you see what it should look like, and you see how the paper is folded. And of course the dark side is the color. We couldn't get color at the time. It would have been beautiful if we had done it in color. And then number 3 shows you the square open, and whenever you see the dotted line, it means that is not on the paper yet. You're going to make that line. But once that line is made, then the crease is shown with a straight line. So then the arrows tell you what to do with either corner. Can you see how easy it is to just fold each corner over, and then you look and see what it produces, and you should have that. So that we thought would be a wonderful thing for children. And if you start with what you made, you get actually an action model, because the arrow tells you to turn the paper over on itself, and you can see it in number 2. And number 3 shows you taking it by the point, and the hands are drawn. And if you just give a little pull to the paper, it comes down into what number 4 looks like. And then if you touch it, the little animal touches the food and is an action fold. Very simple, but showing you that it was done by children who did not know how to read. And the whole book is very clear, very simple, and is an excellent way to get introduced into it. So that was my experience with Sherry, which has been all along a very happy experience, because when we published her second book, our second book, Folding Paper Toys, it was just at the time that her child was born. So I gave her the dedication page, and now her child is married, and it's very exciting to think the friendship lasted that long. I'd like to tell you about a very dear friend of mine by the name of Toshiya Takahama, who lives in Japan, who has been here to America, visited me. When Mr. Kasahara, let's see, it was not Mr. Karahara that came over, one of the Japanese greats came over for the World's Fair with 9 people in the party. And I gave them a banquet. Natalie Epstein gave them a banquet in her home, and they came all dressed in their beautiful clothes. And when they were invited to Natalie's, that time they wore their American clothes. And Natalie had invited all her grandchildren to see this colorful assortment of men and women who arrived in their beautiful costumes and their beautiful kimonos. And they thought they were doing the right thing. They came in their American clothes. And she was so disappointed, and she told them, and they said, well, we'll come again and we'll wear the kimonos for you, which they did. And I met Toshiya at the time. It was an interesting thing. Here were these 9 men and women with an interpreter. The interpreter had absolutely no command of the English language. Every time he tried to translate something for us, it took him so long to fish out the right word that we, not believing that anybody spoke English in the crowd, we spoke quite loudly about the fact that how disgusting to send an interpreter over, and he couldn't really help in any way. A few days after they'd been to my house for dinner, and then they were out to the World's Fair. I had a call from a friend who had spent her whole life in Japan and was very much sought after when people wanted to have a Japanese line of crockery or dinnerware made. They always went to her. I've forgotten her name for the moment. She's an American who lived most of her life in Japan. And she wrote me a note and said she'd like me to come to tea. One of the women who was just here from Japan for a visit, who studied with her sand painting teacher. She did all the cultural things that Japanese do, and they do wonderful things. Do you know what sand painting is? They put sand on a beautiful paper, and then you with a whisk, you can make a scene, a complete beautiful scene on that. And it's one of the things they practice, one of the beautiful art forms. So I said, oh, I'll be delighted to come, and in fact, I'll pick her up at her hotel. I had a car then that I drove, and I'll drive up because she was way up in Riverside Drive. And her home was furnished like a Japanese home. Very few things in it and very beautiful. So when this woman I was to pick up came down the steps and into my car, wearing the most beautiful kimono I'd ever seen, she told me she made it herself. It was Mrs. Takahama, but I had not known the names of the 9 people, because 9 Japanese names were hard to remember. So she spoke in perfect English. And I said, why, I'm surprised to hear that you speak so perfectly. Why weren't you the interpreter? You speak better than he did. She says, in Japan, a woman does not speak in a man's presence. I couldn't believe it. Of course, this was in, what, 1960? I couldn't believe that the women were treated that way until I saw it for myself. And here, how could she have possibly kept herself from talking, you know? I don't think I could have stopped myself from talking. Anyway, we went to tea and we became the best of friends. It was so easy to communicate with her. And she was not as old as I was, but she was not a young woman. She was a grandmother. So we corresponded, and she has published so many, many books. This is one of, perhaps she's published 20 or 30 books, one more beautiful than the other. I brought this one out because it's done in color. And when they had the British had a contest once at one of their meetings, at one of their conventions. We have a wonderful British Origami Society over in England. They gave a prize for the model, any recognizable model with the least number of creases, least number of folds. And she won the prize. And I think there are 3 folds to make that little boat there, that little sailboat. So it's a very colorful book and very, very clear, and has all the traditional folds when anybody wants to study and get to know all the folds that were done in the old days, which is the best way to begin. Isn't that beautiful? And she has invented so many marvelous folds and has given us all these beautiful things to work with. This happens to be a beginner's book, but she's made some of the most difficult ones that we've ever had. So when I wanted to visit Japan and give Alice Gray a trip, treat her to a trip because she'd never been out of the country, I asked Toshiya to meet us and take a vacation from her job because she had raised 4 children and taken care of her mother and father until their late 90s when they died, and did it all herself because her husband died during the war with her knowledge of English. She graduated from one of the most prestigious girls' colleges in her time, valedictorian, and spoke so beautifully and was so good in the language that she was able to make a living for herself. She made thousands and thousands and thousands of Christmas cards every year, so beautiful, and sold those, had a publisher, and she has made all these books, and today we are hoping that she's going to come over to our convention in June. We have our fingers crossed, but we don't know yet. So Toshiya took Alice and me for 10 days for a trip. I wanted particularly to stay at the old hotels where they put the futon on the floor and treat you with so many niceties that we know nothing about. And we had that treat with her when I took Alice with me. So she's been a wonderful friend and still is, Toshiya Takahama. I'd like to say something about a little book that Stephen Wise put out. It's his first book called Wings and Things, and he's already published a few. And this is interesting because everything in the book flies. You know how the youngsters love to fly their airplanes, in which we have so many books written. In fact, we've had 2 airplane contests in which prizes were given for all kinds of things, and one of them was for an origami airplane that would fly. And one of our greats, Dr. Sakota, I think he's an Issei, an American-born Japanese, who is a professor up at Brown University, but retired now. He won the prize in the origami class, so we were very proud of that. And he's written a book, too, which is temporarily out of print, so I haven't gotten it here to show you. But Stephen is one of our young men, and he has created many, many models, and finally went to St. Martin's Press, and they published this book. And it's funny because you wouldn't think that a model like this could fly, but every one of them does fly, and it's an excellent book. A young man came to me once, a puppeteer for hospitality, came from England, and his name was Stephen Biddle. And I was hospitality chairman for the Puppetry Guild of Greater New York, Pagogny we call it. And this young man, we found a couple of places, and then he eventually came and stayed with me for the 3 months that he was here. And he went to Japan on a visit as a puppeteer, but he loved origami and did a lot. He did many beautiful things, even invented some simple things because he entertained children a lot. And he married a Japanese girl. And this Japanese girl made this beautiful doll, which appears on the book posthumously printed of Eric Kenaway's. Eric Kenaway, Steve Biddle found Eric Kenaway dead in bed one day when he went to visit him. He had been a good friend of his. And it's a very, very beautiful, wonderful book, just published. And I wanted to show you the cover because the doll is so beautiful, the traditional Japanese doll. That is an art form all in its own. Kenaway has written many, many books, a member of the British Origami Society. I met him the first time I came over there, and the 11 people I knew and corresponded with all came to my daughter's home for dinner, lunch and dinner, and then and there started the British Origami Society. And Kenaway was a young artist, a young teacher at the time, who won a trip to Japan for being able to learn to speak and write Japanese. But he's no longer with us, unfortunately. And I don't want any more time to go by without mentioning Flori Temko, who calls herself my origami daughter. Flori Temko has written about 25 books. She hasn't stuck completely to origami. This is called Paper Pandas and Jumping Frogs, and was published by the China Books. And she's written other books for them on many other subjects, all connected with paper. So this is a beautiful book too, and I just think flipping through it, you can see how clear the instructions are, and Flori has given us many wonderful books on paper projects. Here's a book that isn't out yet. Origami Omnibus, Paper Folding for Everyone, by Kunihiko Kasahara. And Kasahara I met when he was about 20 years old as a young boy in Japan, at one of my visits. Kasahara has written so many books that I was suspicious that he was in the publishing business because they come out and one is more wonderful than the other. And this one is a particularly interesting book, and I hope that it does come out soon because it treats origami not as a child's playbook, but a very serious tome. It has in it theorems, mathematical theorems, and it's a book that any scientific man would love to own and love to do, and it is so complete in its scope. It's a heavy book. I hope that it really is going to come out soon because everybody is waiting for it. It's one of perhaps 50 or 100 books. You see, after I formed the Origami Center of America, the Japanese realized there was a market here for origami books. And after the fact that I had only one book at the time, after that the market was flooded with books. They all came over and all repeated the same traditional folds in different manners, in different ways, but we had very little new stuff given to us in those days. But it was wonderful how quick they got onto the fact that this was a good market for origami. And so now there are hundreds of books that have been printed, and all of my library, my complete library that I took all these years to accumulate, is now at the Museum of Natural History, resting in Alice Gray's office. She has been an entomologist there all her life, 50 years at the museum, and is an origami lover too. She's been my associate for many years. And Michael Schall has seen to it that origami is now in the museum under the title of the Friends of the Origami Center of America, because they want the work to go on after my demise. When I was about 60 or 65, they began to be nervous about the fact that I had all these original models, and Michael suggested to me that we find a home for it. And he said he would promise me to do the moving. And he did, kept his promise, and did everything. He moved me from 11th Street here with 150 cartons downstairs waiting until I could get everything unpacked. And he moved all the books and paper to where they are now being sold by one of our members. And because I retired from actively selling books and paper. And he saw to it that the library was duly installed in Alice's office. And he's kept his word on everything that he promised. So now if you would like, if we have time, do we have time? Yeah. I would like to do something for you. I, for the last 20 years or so, have been doing a little stunt with a piece of newspaper. We did puppetry here with Alice May Hall, who's a very fine professional puppeteer for many years, and I always opened the show doing a stunt with a piece of newspaper. So I would just like to show you, if I can have your indulgence, because it's just an amusing little story, found its way into print. I told Toshiya the story, and she took it down word for word, and it is in one of her books. And some of the storytellers have changed the wording with my permission, because anybody can make up any story they want, because I think it's a delightful, quick way to entertain a child. So I start my story with, and if you watch very carefully, I'm sure that you can do it when you try yourself. We just go into the original crease, and I start my story with, once upon a time, there was a little boy by the name of David, and he lived with his mother in a little house by the sea. One day, his mother had a few friends in to visit, and they said to him, David, what do you want to be when you grow up? What would you really like to be when you get to be a big boy? And David had never thought about it before. He didn't know what. So he decided to take a walk and think about it. So as he walked, he said to himself, I think it would be wonderful if I could be the captain of a boat. If I could be the captain of a boat, I could sail the 7 seas. I could stand on the poop deck and order all the sailors around. I think I'd like to be the captain of a boat. But after a while, as he went walking, he thought to himself, if there should be a storm and rough weather, I might get very, very seasick. I don't think I want to be the captain of a boat. I think it would be much more fun to be a fireman. Because if I were a fireman, I could climb those steep ladders. I could rescue all the women and children. I think I'd like to be a fireman. And as he continued his walk, he thought to himself, I might get some smoke in my nose. I might catch on fire. I don't think I want to be a fireman. I think it would be much more fun to be Robin Hood, because if I were Robin Hood, I could rob the rich and pay the poor. But then as he went on walking, he said, but I might be taken into prison for being Robin Hood. I don't think I'd like to be Robin Hood. And he continued to walk down, thinking what he might like to be, when he came to the end of the road, and there was the sea in front of him. And on the water, what did he see? A boat sailing along. And since he had wanted to be the captain of a ship, he was very interested. The first thing that he noticed was that the boat struck a great big rock and tore a hole right down the prow, right off. Poor David was so frightened he didn't know what to do. But the boat kept on going until a great big tidal wave came, and off went the stern. Little David was so frightened that he froze, couldn't move. But it was a sturdy little boat, and it went on sailing down the stream. Then all of a sudden, the sun went behind the clouds. It got very dark. It started to thunder and lightning, and a great stroke of lightning came down and tore off the poop deck. Little David jumped up, and he ran to the Coast Guard. But when the Coast Guard got there was nothing left but the captain's shirt. And that was my little story, and it's very simple, and the children loved it. And then if they wanted to learn it, the mothers got a hold of me after the show, and I showed them how to do it. So you can use any story you want. I had a young man tell me, that's not scary enough. We got to have a lot of scary things happen. I said, write your own scenario. You have my permission.